Yeah, so the cuts that they made were in stage 2 of the deficit reduction plan. They originally had estimated them much higher. If you saw the estimates that the consultant brought forward, it was 15 or $16 million. So it seemed, in general, like they played it more conservative. I'm sure there was a lot of background chatter negotiating the totals. I was pleased to see that they're beginning to address the administrative officers. You know, if you look proportionately, they reduced quite a few folk from the administration, and but we've still got a lot of hard choices ahead of us. This is just a starting point. We have stage 3 that the new board will jump in feet first on, and we know that there's continued deficits that are charted if we don't take further action. So the new board has to be ready to do more, and we're looking at the difficult process of that stage 3 that we will have to act on right away.
Initial reaction is that it's a good start, and that's where I think it fits in, just as a starting point. The cuts definitely need to continue to happen, and my concerns are, yes, for the folks that would be part of the reduction in force and their families. I do know that a lot of those positions have materialized within the past 5 to 8 years also. So I think that it's pertinent to reevaluate those positions just to make sure that we're doing what's right for the whole district and making sure we're focusing funds on the educational interface with the teachers, the interventionists, support staff, and all the students. And that's where all funds should be focused, if you ask me. I think that the cuts will have to go further. But I think in order to make further cuts, you're going to have to address the facilities. And I think yesterday at the Committee of the Whole meeting, they started to discuss this. And I think that that's the way the cuts will have to go in the future. Yeah, I think we can squeeze some more money out of other aspects. You know, and I think that there are multiple subjects that we could look into to try to better spend our funds, such as technology in the classroom, such as, you know, that of course the transportation is always a hot topic, and it's a gift that keeps on giving, I think it's been called, and we're continually squeezing a few million out of the transportation budget here and there, but I think that calls for an overall reevaluation, and then also putting it up for a bid, you know, like it should be, just so we have an open and transparent bidding process and wind up with the best value for the services rendered for the district. I think that, yeah, like any cuts, there are potentials for error if we're cutting something that comes too close to the educational interface, which is something I would be wary of. I would definitely make sure the cuts are clear away from where the students are learning in the classroom, and only have cuts that are close to that area if absolutely necessary. For instance, if schools are consolidated and we wind up with an abundance of teachers because classes have been joined together, then discussing what to do with those teachers. I don't think we should cut teaching staff, especially highly qualified niche teaching staff. Nor should we cut interventionists, since interventionists target the opportunity gap most directly in their targeted interventions. So those are some things that I'm thinking about. With school consolidations, I know they're just starting to talk about that. These are something that I've been looking into for a couple of years now, and noticing the ripples, the downstream effects. For instance, if when the Foster School opens, what that does to the surrounding schools. We have good information on how much a student costs as a ratio of student cost per overhead of the school. And those ratios will jump around and move and ripple when you start opening and closing schools. So being mindful of that will help us focus funds more appropriately. Because if we have a school over here that is well below the mean as far as cost per student per year, and then a school over here where the cost per student per year of the students is well above the mean, we need to balance those out so we can actually balance the whole district at nearly the same time.
I think it's a solid plan. I do think that that plan effectively represents the feedback that was shared certainly in a lot of the earlier meetings that I attended, which was a desire to protect as much of the core academic mission as possible within D635. So the focus on maintaining the classroom experience, on maintaining teaching levels, and maintaining as many enrichment programs as possible. So I do think that, while obviously incredibly painful, I think that shrinking the size of the central administration staff does make good economic sense, and it does reflect the wishes of the community, certainly within a lot of the forums that I attended.
I think that I was at the school board meeting when they voted on, I think it was option 2 of the 4 options proposed by the consultant that they hired. And I having glanced at them briefly, I think option number 2 is one of the ones that I would have gone with. I think most of the full-time positions that were cut from the central office. It focused more on administrators, and based upon what I heard from the consultant is that brings the number of administrators per student down to a level more consistent with the student population of District 65, which makes a lot of sense to me. And I think if I were in the board's position at this time in this situation, that is the option that I would have gone with as well.
I think that the plan looks pretty good on paper. I think that's where the tricky part usually lies, is it's always really about the implementation. And that relates pretty well to the work that I do now. It's really like, so now at U.S. Department of Labor, I work in the regions, in the Chicago office. Policy is done in D.C., and the bigger overarching stuff is set in D.C., but then the regions, we're tasked with implementing it. And so I think of this in pretty much the same way. Like, I think the plan does look pretty good. They seem to have tried to cut to the target or cut past the target. But then what's that actually going to look like? The past few years they've done budgets, but they seem to have come in over what those budgets, those plans on paper, they've overspent, and they've done that pretty consistently. So, are they going to be able to keep up with the plan, or is the plan going to end up changing, or are we going to encounter some things that, give people sufficient heartburn they're going to want to back off of? So it's really going to be monitoring to see if, there's any complications with the layoffs they want to make, things like that. So I think that's kind of where I stand on that. I think they're on the right track, and it's going to be kind of difficult for the new board coming in because we don't get to participate in setting up the plan, but we're going to be really in charge of making sure it stays on task, and then going forward with kind of the next phases of that based on the success or failure of the part that we're kind of being handed off.
Well, the board chose, I guess, the least worst option, in my opinion. And so, I think it shows a lot that Dr. Turner reduced the central office as she did, and that student-facing positions were cut the least. So I approve of them going in that direction. It's unfortunate that this is the first of the cuts we will be facing. We'll be facing additional cuts, we know, when we start to close and consolidate the schools.
Well, honestly, I believe the cuts that they made, we have way too many employees making 6 figures. I believe that we need to lower that even more if we can. I believe our financial situation is in grave danger. Everything to me is on the table. We need to make more cuts. We need to make the necessary cuts, not the cuts that we think are going to make us, put us where we need to be. We need to make the necessary cuts. I always go back to my wife, because my wife always tells me, if you're going to fill a jar, fill it with the biggest rocks first, and then you put the pebbles around it. So to me, the biggest the rocks are those employees with the 6 figures. I believe our teachers and people may get upset about this, but I honestly believe our teachers need to have salaries close to those 6 figures. Those are the soldiers. They're on the ground. They are in the battlefield. They are the ones that can tell us what students need the most help, where they need it. They need to have the authority to do those things. So financially, it's huge, but I also believe clear and constant communication with the stakeholders, with the community, will help us get to where we need to be. I feel like there are things that we can do. I've been having conversations with my posse. My posse consists of me, myself, and I. And then I run these ideas, by other people. We need to have things to raise money for our district. Everything's on the table. Everything is on the table. I also feel like we have the money right here in our district. The more transparent we are, the more communicative we are, the more problems can get solved, the more ideas can be on the table. I interviewed our 2nd Ward Alderman, Chrissy Harris, for my podcast, and one thing she said that I loved: don't come to me with complaints. Come to me with solutions so that we can sit around the table and work them out.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the fundamentals of the budget, just from a high level, we were running somewhere around $25,000, $26,000 per student in spend. We had, which is very high considering districts around us. Just as a comparison point, Oak Park River Forest, which has a similar size demographic, they spend $17,000 per student. Not to say that we should go to that level, but their outcomes are the same. So we're obviously not getting a return on the investment that we're spending in our students right now. Another metric that I look at is the number of administrators per student. We're running about, I think, 89, 93 to 1. Average around is 143 to 1. So we're pretty heavy on administrators. I think that's common knowledge around. People are kind of upset about that. So our administrators are also the highest paid administrators around. So from a budget perspective, it seems that there were some fundamental metrics that were just out of line for the size of our district. And as I look at it as a board member, it's what is the return on that investment?
Well, I mean, I think in some sense part of the challenge with understanding the path is that in the approach to humanization, we don't really know what the cuts mean. So we understand transportation, we understand 73 people, 26 from central office, but it's not clear, like, what does it mean central office is going to be doing differently. So in that sense, it's hard to, I know 13.2, but I don't really understand what it means by the structure of what's going to happen differently. You can cut, but what does it mean about how we're going to, with who's here, how we're going to do the services that exist. So in that sense, it's a little unclear if that's the board's approach or if that's the superintendent and the consultant. So for me, going forward, needs to be more clear the board's role, the superintendent's role, and who are the consultants speaking to in that way, shape, or form. Because I don't feel as a community we've had enough, we know enough about what these changes are going to bring forth to begin to figure out what's next. Now I'm sure that's about to happen, but in the point leading up to the decision, it's not clear, besides 73 people, what's really going to be different here.
So the path that was chosen had to be taken because if we don't reduce the deficit, we will be in threat of takeover by the Illinois State Board of Education. So that the amount was kind of dictated by that threat. The way the school board approached it was to try and minimize the impact to direct student teaching in the classroom. So that's why that breakout, that's how they came to that breakout. So the emphasis was on administrative positions, although in speaking with some of the teachers that are currently in the district, some of those administrative positions may actually be people that are part of those 5 bargaining units. So that's something that has to be detailed. The other portion that was contested was the transportation. And there was a presentation by the JEH staff regarding the impact that would have on student attendance if those buses were pulled. So that was a decision that was made at the meeting. The other category is non-instructional staff. It's the last category. And so that has to be detailed. The whole deficit reduction plan is pretty specific, but it has to be detailed because it's been a week. The teachers I've talked to are very concerned about, well, what is that? Which classrooms are going to be cut? Because there's some consolidations of the classrooms as well. And looking at the top heaviness of the school board in terms of some of the positions that were implemented under Horton's superintendency, the elevation of some of the basic executive positions from that into assistant superintendent positions. I mean, I've thoroughly looked at the organizational chart. So, and it's 20 pages long. So I kind of use my educator's lens to look at that in terms of how it would impact students at the classroom level. So that plan has to be detailed. Right now it's just the beginning. And when they start telling people which teachers are leaving from which schools, in terms of equity, we're going to have to take a look at that, because some classroom consolidations have already happened, and in some situations it hasn't been equitable. So it's just a start. I mean, once they tell people who's actually not coming back next year, then the real communication will have to start, because that means planning has to be done so that schools will be ready to open in the fall.
I think it's hard for any human to not feel some level of concern for the need for cuts and the implementation of cuts. Through the eyes of a board member or potential board member, it kind of comes with the territory. So you have to have a little bit of thick skin around being able to enact difficult decisions like this. And this is already on the radar for the next board, but we're not out of the woods. This was essentially a step towards having a little bit more sustainability and solvency, a necessary step for the purposes of next year, essentially to do our best to avoid a need for short-term borrowing. Because that, even though right now, from a lot of conversations I've had, we're not necessarily firmly on the state's radar. I know there's been a lot of fear around that. But if we didn't make these decisions, we wouldn't have been, we would have been much more likely to be in that kind of a position. And then you get more concerned that you're going to have a lot less agency for how those cuts are implemented. You're not going to have feedback sessions with the community. You're going to have someone who's literally just looking at line items on a sheet and cutting in the quickest way possible. And I think that's the most troubling thing about the financial situation in general for me, is balancing short-term needs with long-term consequences and looking ahead. I think that kind of puts us into this next phase where not only we're looking at remaining deficit projections for years beyond the next school year, but how does that relate to our overall strategic plan? Because I think that's a really critical piece in terms of understanding which areas we should be looking closely at, because this round was essentially just looking 1 year ahead. We can't be in this cycle of doing that every year. We do have to go through budget exercise on an annual basis. From an approval and review standpoint, we have an ongoing obligation to make sure that we're tracking towards what we originally forecasted and not having surprises at the end of the year like we've had in recent years. But I think this phase 3 that's been sort of framed around school closures and consolidations, those are really hard decisions, and I think that's been sort of centered in that conversation, but I don't think it's fair to say that that's the exclusive way we're going to get to a sustainable financial future. And I think it's up to us to solicit enough community feedback to really understand, what are the different levers that we can pull and which ones are going to have the biggest impact to the community, and most importantly, the people in the classrooms, our students and our educators.
I think that that's a complicated question, and let me start out by saying I understand the amount of work and effort that went into developing those 4 scenarios, and obviously people are working double time, triple time on coming up with the scenarios. I would have liked to at least see one scenario that had included what are the savings with potentially a school closing, just as a comparison, to see this is what we might be able to save if we close a school. I understand the ramifications of those firings. Those are people with jobs and families, and that's going to be difficult. I would like to get a better understanding of these 72 positions, for example. I know that they've been described as non-student facing. However, that was a question I asked of the superintendent at one of the deficit restructuring meetings that I went to, and I was told that those were it was just a generic term to describe the position. However, at the last board meeting, it sounded like when they were asked specifically about that number of savings, it sounded like there was actually salaries that had been added up. So it seems like they actually looked at positions to eliminate. But without knowing what those positions are, it's difficult to comment on, is that a good idea or a bad idea? And I think that and I understand they're trying to be sensitive because they don't, I'm sure there's some contractual things with the unions that they need to abide by, but it's difficult to sort of evaluate the actual changes on being good or bad or could have been better without having the details of the plan. I know the scenario that was selected was kind of the mid-ground. I know that they came off of some of the busing savings that has been due to just some of the changes that were done in COVID that have not been rolled back. But I would like to get sort of into the weeds of the actual numbers to really kind of, before I weigh in on is this a good plan or a bad plan? I think that in general they did a good job of sort of laying out different options and different ways to save. But again, I think that there should have been at least one scenario that had a school closing to kind of weigh the balance of what they're doing. And I think that there should have been a little bit more time between sort of the public gathering information and when they make a decision. I mean, there was basically just 2 weeks between when the scenarios were announced and when they made a decision about them. So it made it difficult to sort of, get information from the community. I know they set up 3 meetings to do that, but it's tough to get community feedback when there's only 2 weeks to provide feedback.
Are there specific concerns that you have? About any aspects of the plan beyond the personnel?
Yeah, I think that again it goes to we're looking at sort of the big picture of these cuts. We don't have the actual numbers on how is this actually going to work? How is this actually going to be realized? It seems to be light on, if we cut this contract, it directly results into these number of dollars of savings. you know, that's kind of where I'd like to get more information on.